I'm Lisa Rigasich. I'm producer of Pinot Days, and I'm very, very happy to see you guys. This is going to be a phenomenal tasting. Tonight you're going to drink 18 wines in 5 flights. The first flight is all Russian River Valley. The third flight, Russian River. Fifth flight, Russian River. The fifth flight only has 2 wines, but they're goodies, okay?
Today, wine enthusiasts everywhere recognize the Russian River Valley as a consistent source of the finest Pinot Noir and Chardonnay wines in the world. It's hard to believe that it wasn't always this way. Only a few generations ago, much of this region, beginning about 60 miles north of San Francisco, was known as West County, and the West County farmers who grew grapes were a comical bunch to their neighbors in Dry Creek and Alexander valleys. Grapes grown in West County were purchased inconsistently and cheaply. In those days, wine country in northern Sonoma County began in Healdsburg and headed north.
If you remember, not too many years ago, it was a little bit of a, joke's not the word, but if you had grapes down here in Russian River areas, for Christ's sakes, the guys in Dry Creek and Alexander Valley would make fun of us.
Well, they laugh at us all the time.
Because we couldn't get sugar and we had high acid and all this kind of stuff. Now, all of a sudden, if you got grapes in the Russian River area here, we have a pretty good product.
1973, we were going to plant grapes. And in talking with the Sonoma County Extension and everybody at Davis, and people just basically said, this area near the Russian River is too cool, you don't want to grow grapes here, you want to buy property in Dry Creek Valley, Alexander Valley, you don't want to be growing grapes down here, it's too cool. In fact, we couldn't even get a loan.
No one can say how long it took Giovanni Fopiano to travel from Genoa, Italy to San Francisco, California during the 1860s. The Atlantic crossing took from 2 to 5 weeks and cost between $15 and $40. Immigrants of the 1860s entered the United States at Castle Garden, New York. Italian immigrants often crowded into Mulberry Street to find work while waiting for a ship. The first part of the voyage to San Francisco was dangerous because it meant going from the Union Port of New York to the embattled ports of the Southern Confederate States and finally to New Orleans, where the 7-day voyage to Panama began. Crossing Panama from Colon City to Panama City by canoe, mule, and on foot took at least 5 days. Travel from Panama City to San Francisco took a week and could cost $400 or more, depending on the size of the waiting crowd. The voyages and ports of the 1860s offered crowded and primitive accommodations, tainted food, smallpox, typhus, dysentery, cholera, and malaria. Giovanni Fopiano's arrival in San Francisco, like those of other immigrants of his time, was an exceptional achievement. After such a journey, making a life in California must have seemed easy by comparison. Giovanni arrived in San Francisco about 15 years after the California Gold Rush had begun. The adventurous 19-year-old went to Sonora and the California Sierra Mountains and then to Oregon looking for gold. He returned to California to sell fruit in San Jose and San Francisco. Around 1875, Giovanni returned to Italy and married Rosa Rosasco. John, as he became known, and his bride returned to Healdsburg, California, and settled near West Side Road. They raised fruit, vegetables, and 10 children. John, together with his eldest son, Louis A. Fopiano, who worked in a cannery, purchased Riverside Winery just south of Healdsburg in 1896 during the first grapevine phylloxera epidemic. By 1896, San Francisco no longer resembled a frontier town. Gold had transformed it into a thriving city filled with prosperous citizens who required fine foods and wine for their households, hotels, and restaurants. San Francisco became the principal market for Fopiano produce and wine. On a trip to San Francisco in 1904, Louis A. Fopiano was selling produce and wine to John and Victor Canada, the owners of a North Beach grocery near Bay and Columbus Streets.
My uncles had a store in San Francisco, and
They asked, my father went down there to sell wine and have lunch, and he said, come on and have. And they took him out to lunch. My mother was out there. Next week he went out and down and married her.
Next week? Huh?
Yeah, he went there, had lunch, and I guess next week he must have had arrangements during the week to get married. She was from Europe, Italy.
Her family was one of your customers.
Yeah.
Your dad's customer. The union between the Canadas of San Francisco and the Fopianos of Sonoma County provided a business alliance that not only prospered in 1904 and 1905, but also after April 18, 1906. As San Francisco recovered, there was a great demand for food peddlers at distribution centers. John Fopiano's produce business was thriving. Louis A. Fopiano's Riverside Vineyard was increasingly diminished by phylloxera. Do you remember what year you were born?
1910?
In 1910, the year Louis J. Fopiano was born, Riverside Winery was in decline. Zinfandel grapes did not always do well in areas near the Russian River because of the cool, foggy summers. As a result, harvests were often delayed until October or November, when fall rains led to mildew and rot. There was no technology at the time to combat these diseases. Because of these problems and the phylloxera infestation, which was rampant in the area, Louis A. wanted to replant Riverside Vineyard. His father, John, wanted to sell. In 1911, Louis A. Fopiano borrowed enough money from his wife's San Francisco family to purchase his father's share of the business and to replant the vineyard. Louis and John separated and hardly spoke before John's death in 1922. Did you farm always with tractors and equipment, or did you farm with horses?
Well, first horses. I started in with horses. Then tractors came in a little later.
In 1917, when the Fopianos were finally reaping the rewards of their newly planted vineyard, the powerful temperance movement produced the Volstead Act, followed by the 18th Amendment. On January 16, 1920, wineries were closed, kept under lock and key by the federal government. Even owners could not enter without a federal agent present. Prohibition regulations allowed heads of households to make 200 gallons of wine each year. This exception created a large, profitable market for California wine grapes in East Coast cities and in San Francisco, whose European immigrant populations always drank wine. Within a week after Prohibition became the law of the land, grape buyers representing East Coast markets appeared in Sonoma County, offering $25 a ton for black grapes.
So there was big money in moving grapes to where there were large European populations who made wine. You know, New York, New Jersey, Chicago, New Orleans.
Grapes that appeared freshly picked upon arrival at the eastern freight yards, and grapes that would easily impart a rich red color to homemade wine fetched the highest prices. Alicante Bouschet, a tough, thick-skinned grape that made a bland wine, filled both of these requirements and became the East Coast favorite. Alicantes, together with other thick-skinned grapes, grew well in the hot climate of the Central Valley. Vast Central Valley vineyards produced and shipped so many carloads of these varieties that by 1925 prices began to fall and many West County vineyards became prune, pear, and apple orchards.
My father, our original ranch was all grapes when they purchased it in 1919. My grandfather, father, and great uncle went through Prohibition. My father, they pulled all the vineyard out, planted prunes and pears, and built some chicken houses, went in the chicken business.
As grape prices fell, Some growers went east with their grapes to make sure that they were receiving full value from the brokers who represented them. Joseph Gallo, a grower from Escalon in California's Central Valley, was so intimidated by the deception, fraud, and robbery that occurred in Al Capone's Chicago freight yards that he refused to return. Instead, his 17-year-old son, Ernest Gallo, volunteered to sell his family's grapes in the Chicago yards. Young Ernest was not intimidated by lawlessness or falling prices. He quickly adapted and mastered the skills required to profitably sell his family's grapes. Ernest returned to Chicago for the next 6 years without ever being robbed or outwitted. While the Gallo family could depend on Ernest Gallo's sales skills to get them through Prohibition, survival became more precarious for the Fopiano family when, in the middle of Prohibition, Louis A. Fopiano died, leaving his wife Matilda with 3 children, Rosalind 17, Norma 16, and Louis J. Fopiano 14. Matilda enlisted help from her family, the Canadas, who were well established in San Francisco's Italian North Beach community. With great skill, determination, and some luck, Matilda Fopiano organized her family to continue through Prohibition and the beginning of the Great Depression. So these pictures, say around 1909, 1907, show a person that you believe to be Uncle Botch, and he was...
That's what my father said it was Botch.
I see.
He would come down and help. After my grandfather passed away, he also came down here and helped my grandmother run this ranch until my father came of age.
Did he have any land or property or anything like that?
He was a partner. He was a partner with his other brother in Digger Bend, which was a big ranch at that time out there with lots of prunes and some vineyard. And he was a partner in that. But as I said, he never married, so he had a lot of other things he did. He did other things with his money.
During that period, 1920 to 1932, a lot of wineries disappeared during that time.
Correct.
But Fopiano continued on through that. I mean, that's a remarkable accomplishment.
Well, we were able to continue on. One, I mentioned we did a little bootlegging. I mean, the family did a little bootlegging on the side. And another thing is most of the varieties we had here, we could ship to the East Coast to home winemakers. It's mentioned that your uncle Botch got caught with a truck ready to go to San Francisco.
Yeah.
Were they selling much wine in San Francisco?
I don't know if he was or not. I know he was taking quite a bit out. He was doing all right, but he didn't talk much.
He didn't talk about it much, huh?
Yeah.
As far as anyone can tell, there was no shortage of wine in restaurants during Prohibition. Owners broke into their own wineries and devised schemes for removing wine and replenishing it. Frequently water was added, and federal agents, who could often be bribed, did not always check the alcohol content of the crust-covered liquid in the redwood storage tanks. Sometimes wine mixtures were transferred to stills and converted to brandy, which Italians call grappa. Locals called illegally distilled alcohol jackass. During Prohibition, the federal agents came and you got rid of some wine.
Dumped it down the side of the highway. That's left to go down the side of the highway, and a lot of people came and got one from Hillsburg and just filled bottles up and gallons up, come park on the side of the highway and get off and try and fill their jugs up.
What do you remember about the start of Prohibition and during Prohibition?
Well, that Prohibition, that was a farce. On a farce. Everybody bootlegged it. Every place in the county, they had a still where there was water, was a spring. I used to deliver sugar at nights. Get sugar down, I forgot the name. In Santa Rosa, there was a wholesale that sold sugar, you know. I go up there in the afternoons and pick up a load of sugar and then bring it in. And I'd go out at 1 o'clock at night and deliver it to the door to deliver it at night. I made $15, $20 on a trip. Working on the ranch, you got 25 cents an hour.
Oh, yeah. Tell us the story about Walter Barney.
Well, how did you meet Walter Barney? Did Gary Cannot introduce you
Yeah,
to?
that's right. I met. That's right. My cousin Gary Canado had a garage there on Union Street.
Yeah, he was a pilot.
That's right.
He flew for Varney.
Yeah, he flew for Varney, and that's how I met him. And
Walter Varney, a native San Franciscan, learned to fly during World War I and became a flight instructor, air taxi operator, and a barnstorming stunt pilot during the Roaring Twenties. In 1925, the Congress authorized the Postal Service to begin contracting with private airlines to deliver mail by air. Varney examined the routes and bid on the most remote and dangerous one between Pasco, Washington, Boise, Idaho, and Elko, Nevada. He was the only bidder. In 1926, a series of mergers began between Varney Airlines and 4 other carriers that ended in 1933 with the merged companies becoming United Airlines. In 1934, Varney formed Varney Speed Lines, which became Continental Airlines when it was sold to Robert Six in 1936.
What about going down to Palm Springs when you were fancy-free?
during those times, Varney would go to Palm Springs, and I'd drive as Duesenbergs. He had 2 of them. I'd take everybody, all my friends, for a ride. Well, I'd take it down here and do it about 90, 100 miles an hour. They would do 130 miles an hour.
They were fast.
In 1933, near the end of Prohibition, federal agents raided Botch Fopiano Still near Digger Bend.
You, in 32, when it looked like Roosevelt was going to be elected, you made wine that year?
Yeah, that's the year I made wine.
So we'd have it to sell when repeal came?
Federal enforcement of Prohibition continued through all of 1932 and most of 1933, while the states, one by one, ratified the 21st Amendment, which would repeal Prohibition. Although many Sonoma County wineries and vineyards disappeared during Prohibition, Riverside had done fairly well. Together, the unlikely duo of Matilda Fopiano, who spoke little English, and Uncle Botch sold enough grapes, prunes, wine, and jackass during Prohibition to keep Riverside in business. Aviation pioneer Walter Varney had a dramatic impact on the life of Lou Fopiano, a fatherless farm boy from Healdsburg, so that when repeal became a reality, Lou Fopiano was well prepared to lead the newly named Fopiano Winery into the extraordinary competitions of the post-Prohibition wine business.
I didn't have money to buy grapes when we first started out, even though grapes were cheap at $14 a ton. I came up with a profit-sharing plan where I would credit the grower with 100 gallons of our wine for every ton of grapes he sold us. When I sold the wine for 50 cents a gallon, I would pay the grower $50 for the ton of grapes. Those growers made a lot of money with us those first few years. Ernest Gallo.
On June 14, 1933, 24-year-old Ernest Gallo, whose business skills were learned in the railroad yards of Prohibition-era Chicago, and his brother Julio applied for a federal permit to make 50,000 gallons of wine. Within 6 months, the inexperienced Gallo brothers sought permission to more than triple their wine output to 180,000 gallons from their newly rented building at 4th and D Streets in Modesto, California. These beginners, with little money, secured grape contracts with Central Valley, California growers by promising to pay for the grapes after the newly made, non-aged wine was sold. In 1933, only a few people knew Ernest and Julio. Fewer still had yet heard of Gallo wine. Post-Prohibition laws made it illegal for wineries to sell wine directly across state lines. Instead, wineries sold bulk wine in barrels or tanks to distributors who bottled it under their own labels and sold it to buyers in states where they were licensed. Many of the people who had been grape brokers or bootleggers during Prohibition were now licensed wine, liquor, and beer distributors.
We shipped a lot of wine to New York.
It was all through this one family?
Yes.
Remember the names?
Santarpia.
Santarpia?
Yeah, on First Avenue.
On First Avenue. Was that a company?
No, it was a family organization.
Your father has talked a lot about the Santarpia, Sabo Santarpia.
Yeah.
How did he make that connection? Do you know?
Through a distributor in New York, which was North American Wine Company, which was owned by the Miacho family. Benny Miacho. They controlled all the olive oil. They controlled a good part of all the olive oil going into New York.
I used to go there first. He was on First Avenue. I didn't know anybody else, and I'd go back there. I was just a kid, you know, and I'd go back there in their store in the back there. And boy, there was some rough guys. Be pretty careful what you said, because there was the gangsters in those days in the city.
Tell us the story about when you were at Santarpia's office and the car was parked downstairs.
Oh, Benny Miacho's car was parked. He was in there talking to Santarpia's. Come out and the car was gone. Totally stripped. They took everything off of it. He walked back in there and got on the phone, called somebody up. I don't know who. All the stuff came back in the car. All put back together in the car. I don't know who it was. I never did find out who it was. But they knew, somebody knew who it was stealing everything.
When they reopened in December 1933, the Fopiano Wine Company shipped nearly 100,000 gallons of one-year-old wine to their East Coast Miacho and Santarpia distributors in New Jersey and New York. By comparison, in 1933 and 1934, the newly formed Gallo Winery sold 180,000 gallons of wine, which was not yet a year old, to a broad network of distributors who suddenly appeared in the Ernest Gallo portfolio. There is no apparent explanation for the profound early success of Ernest and Julio Gallo, who had never before made wine or sold it. What do you remember about growing up on Frost Ranch?
Do I remember as a child?
Yeah, 1933, what was
The Depression. So times are tough, yeah. We had hops. We had Gravenstein apples for early, and then we had winter apples for packing. We had prunes, we had grapes. Grapes went to a cooperative. My grandfather, four other fellows, Harvey, and formed a co-op in Windsor. By going to the cooperative and making their own wine, they can make more money that way than just selling the grapes outright.
From 1935 until 1956, the members of the Windsor Co-op harvested their grapes and brought them to the co-op winery where they were pressed into wine. The wine was then shipped in barrels or tank cars to Fruit Industries Limited, who bottled it and distributed it to stores and restaurants throughout the United States. How did the growers get paid when the Windsor Co-op was selling all of its bulk wine to Fruit Industries Limited?
When you delivered a crop, you got so much a ton for the grapes, and then you got the rest of it, what you had coming.
That's what co-ops did. You'd say your first year maybe you'd get 50% of it, the next year a little bit more. So you had some money coming from that harvest over the next 3 or 4 years. And they call them retainers.
Did your grandfather ever talk about the quality of the grapes or what kind of vintage it was going to be or anything like that?
Yeah, it's always a kick. Well, it's just how times that the vines we have are always great big vines, and like this, the white grapes were, especially because they were French Caliber or Sauvignon Vert. And in those days, remember going, they'd suffer by hand, they go underneath and you have a pack or a sack, you suffer. But I remember going around and he'd look back up underneath, and here's all these grapes hanging down, and he said, okay, they're looking, good. They didn't do tests, and they didn't pull leaves, they don't, but we didn't do any of the other type of stuff that it obviously goes on now. If it got a disease, I guess that was it. And at Christmas time, at the Christmas dinner, Grandpa would open it up, and he'd open up the bottles, and they'd taste it. And normally it was just, it was a red or a white. There was nothing, a Sauterne or Burgundy or something like that. And it was always kind of, everybody had a little glass, it's kind of a ritual of some type on his part. And they'd taste it, and he'd say, oh, yes, this has been a good year. This is a good, it was a funny thing. It was a kick.
Eventually, fruit industries began buying, bottling, and distributing wine from a total of 11 California grower cooperatives. Fruit industries called their new wine blend 11 Cellars.
We wasn't too happy about some of the things that they were doing in 11 Cellars. That's when we decided to go with Gallo. They were happy to get us at the time.
When did Gallo start doing business with the Sonoma County Co-op?
56. They liked the wine from up here to blend with that valley wine, because the up here makes a better wine. That's what they've been telling me all these years. Like over in the valley, there's a lot of that grapes that gets a lot of sugar, but it don't have the acid. And over here, it's got a better balance to it. You got acid and sugar. So that's why they want to get some from here to blend with the other ones. Because the ones with that certain amount of acid, that your wine will keep a lot better, it'll age better.
I always give Giulio the credit for this, and probably Ernest too, is that their Hardy Burgundy, they could have made that out of Central Valley cheap wine, but they really wanted to make that their best wine. And so they basically bought huge amounts of bulk wine from Napa and Sonoma, a lot from Sonoma, and put it in Hardy Burgundy. Now, I never said that on the label, it was just California. It sounds strange to say, okay, well, instead of paying 80 cents a gallon for red wine, they were paying $1.50. $1.50 sounds pretty cheap, or $2 a gallon. But that kept the people alive in Napa and Sonoma in their bulk wines. And it was a premium. And Gallo did that to give the consumers a better wine with Hardy Burgundy.
Did the co-op pay the same price for all the varieties of red grapes?
No, if the grapes had more sugar, they used to get a better price. But there was a lot of different black grapes. We used to put them in one tank for fermenting. Zinfandel, that went separate.
Who did you deal with at Gallo?
Well, Julio, we used to see him every year. We'd go down to Modesto, or he'd come up here, and you could talk to. He was easier to talk to than Ernie.
Gallo was one of my biggest clients. Always have a good story about my first meeting with Giulio Gallo, if that's okay to tell it. I was 28 years old when this happened, 28, 29. Called Giulio up and said, I'd like to come over and visit. And he said, sure, I know your uncle, know the family, your family, so come on down to Modesto and we'll talk about the bulk business. So I get my car, I go to Modesto, pull up in the parking lot, look at the big building in there, throw up, get back in my car, drive around Modesto a little bit, and just kind of get my head straight and go back. Didn't park in the same spot, by the way. Went in and saw Giulio, and actually had a good meeting. Kind of tried to figure out what a broker did, because I really didn't quite know. We talked it through, so I got a better picture of that. And he became one of my biggest customers for many, many years.
When we had meetings for the settling the price of the wine and the grapes, Gallo used to come up with his attorney and all big shots, you know. And the whole board used to talk with Julio Gallo, and that's when we decided what the final price of each crop would be.
What time of year did you determine that?
Well, it was after harvest. It was about this time of the year. Sometimes it'd be in the end of November or the beginning of December.
When you decided what the price of the harvest was going to be, was it the price of the harvest that was just passed or the price of the harvest that was coming up?
The one that was just passed, yeah.
So after the grapes were in and the wine was made and it was delivered, then Gallo would tell you how much you would get as the final payment.
Yeah. We'd do. Sometimes we'd have to do a little haggling to get a few extra dollars out of him. But
Ian J. Gallo's interest in Sonoma County wines began in 1934 when they first contacted Fry Brothers Winery in Dry Creek Valley, about 10 miles north of the Russian River. Even at the beginning of their remarkable wine careers, the Gallos were well acquainted with the quality of what Julio called North Coast wines. By 1948, Fry Brothers had become a contract winery for Gallo. In 1971, a Fry Brothers feud led to a Gallo partnership in Fry Brothers Winery. In 1977, Gallo became the sole owner of Fry Brothers, which became Ian J. Gallo Sonoma.
and then after that, we were bringing the grapes to Fry Brothers up at Gallo's plant. There was a couple of years there that we crushed all the white grapes, Gallo's and ours, the membership. We crushed the whites at Windsor, and Gallo wanted all the blacks crushed at his plant. But that didn't last long. Then he wanted all of them crushed at his plant.
The acquisition of Fry Brothers Winery by Gallo led to the elimination of the Windsor Co-op. Gallo replaced the Windsor Co-op wine with Gallo wine that Gallo made from grapes from Sonoma County growers who had previously been members of the Windsor Co-op, but were now contracted to sell grapes to Gallo. The co-op lost its best grapes and its only wine client simultaneously.
87, I think, when they quit crushing.
Is that when the Windsor Co-op stopped?
Yeah. Got us out of the way.
And as time went on and the business got more refined, it became harder and harder for the co-ops to survive because, again, they were driven by agriculture and putting their wines together and not driven by marketing. And so, again, the better players, and I keep bringing up Gallo, and their name will be part of all this because they've been such a big part of Sonoma and so much a big part of the U.S. wine business, the California wine business, that they put tremendous pressure on the different co-ops. Either they bought the wines from the co-ops extremely cheap because they could put the pressure on them that made those co-ops less profitable, and or if the co-ops were in case goods, then they had to compete with somebody like Gallo, and that wasn't going to make them survive in the long haul.
My grandfather was left on a doorstep in Fort Novelasco, and these people went out, and there is this baby in a box. They asked around, nobody knew anything about it. They put him in an orphanage in Lucca down there, and as he got older, they said, well, He hasn't got a name. We got to give him a name. So I don't know how they come up with it. It doesn't really mean anything. But they called him Michele, which is Michael, Rocchioli. And that's how the Rocchioli name started. It was my grandfather. There's no other Rocchioli in the world except our family.
While Prohibition dramatically changed the wine business forever, Sonoma County's most lucrative agricultural crop, hops, was not so drastically affected. Hops were dried in kilns, and although the U.S. market was lost during Prohibition, dried Russian River hops were shipped to foreign markets where they produced the strong flavors that were favored in the beers and ales of the 1920s. Small hop fields stretched all the way from Santa Rosa to Healdsburg, but the largest concentration of kilns was at Wooler Ranch near the intersection of West Side Road and the Russian River. Like many Sonoma County Italian immigrants during the early part of the 20th century, Michele Rocchioli was a laborer at Wooler Ranch where he lived and raised a family. Your grandfather came from Italy to Wooler Ranch?
Yeah.
Did your grandfather then get your father a job?
Yeah. My dad was born in 1902.
And over the years, my dad became superintendent of that ranch.
Actually, the family came in 1938
And leased the place and raised hops and a few grapes. And I guess that was pretty rough first couple of years, and then things started turning around. You know, I was a big kid. I grew up, when I was 12, I was 6 foot tall already, and I had size 12 shoes. And my dad, he used to go around and brag about my feet, you know, everywhere we went. I had to show everybody my feet. God, that was awful. Anyway, we raised hops until 53, and then there was no more market. So we decided to try raising some beans. Sacramento Freezers came along and contracted us for 10 acres. Then, as we went along, the prices never increased. The picking costs went up. So what we did is started putting some grapes in.
Now, these are all head fruit grapes?
No. The first ones we raised were French Combar. We put them on a 2-wire trellis. We were one of the first ones to put it on a 2-wire trellis.
Yeah.
In 1944, A.J. Winkler and Maynard Amarine from the University of California at Davis divided the grape-growing world into regions according to the total heat contained in the 7-month growing season. Defining these regions established a relationship between climate and grape quality for different wine grape varieties. In the early 60s, Bob Sisson, the University of California farm advisor for Sonoma County, using the Winkler-Amarine model, began advising growers in the cool region around the Russian River to plant early ripening, well-defined varieties of wine grapes. There was considerable resistance to Sisson's advice because the varietals Sisson recommended grew in small clusters and led to small yields. Since Gallo and its client wineries were buying all varieties of red and white grapes by the ton, most growers whose livelihood depended on their grape production preferred to take their chances delivering large quantities of grapes that were often low in sugar.
And then we planted the early Burgundies, and I tried to tell my dad I wanted to plant Pinot Noir or Chardonnay. No. So we got...
Well, how did you get into early Burgundy?
Them and my uncles, you know, the old timers said, "Oh, no, put those damn varietals in. You're not going to get anything out of that, you know." And they were right in a way. My dad passed away in 1966, and so I was going to put in Pinot Noir, and I did.
I always wanted Pinot Noir, and there wasn't anyone growing it in this area or making it. And
there was a lot of what they called Gamay Beaujolais. It was considered, what it was a university-improved form of Pinot Noir. The university was trying to help the growers
So they got it so it's producing as high as 10 tons per the acre.
That was their objective.
Yeah, there's the objective. And need, I'm saying that's wrong. We got to go the other way. We got to get something that produces less and better quality.
More than one half of these California Pinot Noirs are defective, exhibiting bitterness, oxidized appearances, weediness, vegetable aromas, and harsh and biting flavors. San Francisco Vintners Club. For some reason, Pinot Noir in California has never been able to approach the heights it has reached in Burgundy. At first, it was easy to blame this failure on the growers and winemakers who, it was reasoned, were not as seasoned in making any complicated Olympian wines as were the French. Over the last 20 years, California winemakers have proven most of their wines the equal of many European classics, which leaves everyone very embarrassed about Pinot Noir. Was it the sun, or the temperature, or the mists, or the rainfall, or the time of harvest? There had to be a reason, and old-timers and wunderkind alike planted Pinot from Monterey to Healdsburg to find the perfect spot. It appears they're still looking. Roger Morris, The Washington Star.
In the 1960s, putting in Pinot Noir was not so easy. In order to plant Pinot Noir, Rocchioli would have to manufacture his own plants. He had to obtain rootstocks, plant them in the spring. Rocchioli then had to find a reliable source of Pinot Noir cuttings, making sure the cuttings were not Gamay Beaujolais, and graft the growing rootstocks in August of the same year. How did you first sell the Pinot Noir?
In the 73 was Phil Davis finding the first grapes.
Yeah, I guess that was it. Yeah, I think so.
He's one of the first little wineries in the area, actually. You know, there was no, when there was no little wineries, all our grapes primarily went to Gallo.
That was the other thing. We had to have someone who would make it and experiment with it to get the best out of it. And Davis Bynum, who had just started his winery down the road about a couple of miles, and he agreed to work on it. I had to buy some barrels. We tried various woods, and because Pinot is a lot trickier than any of the other grapes you grow.
Did you know of any market for Pinot Noir when you purchased Joe Rocchioli's grapes?
No. Did we have a market for it?
Yes.
No, we didn't. We didn't really know how to market it.
So you purchased grapes from Joe Rocchioli at a little more than twice as much as he was getting for them at the time.
Right, right.
To make a wine that you had never made before.
Right.
You didn't know how you could sell it.
I had made Pinot Noir once before. I made Pinot Noir in 1967 from a vineyard out in Livermore. So. I started making wine in 1951. We started the winery in Albany, and right next door to the Volkswagen used car lot in a former plumbing warehouse. So we had all the drains and everything we needed. It was very convenient. When I first started the winery in 1965, I had been a judge at the state fair, and I had met a lot of people from Davis and from wineries all over the place. You know, when I started the winery in '65, there were, I think, 10 wineries in the Napa Valley bottling with their own label. There were only about 11 here in Sonoma County. I bought a vineyard in '71 up in St. Helena, which is now Whitehall Vineyard. We tried to get a winery there. We had built a winery there. We got shot down by people who were protesting. This was back in '72, that there were too many wineries. They didn't want any more. Of course, since then there've been about 300 new ones. my friend Howard Allen, whose property we're living on right now, the Allen Vineyard, said, come on over to our part of the world. He said, we have better grapes anyways. But so we came over and just coincidentally, after coming over here and visiting in this very house in 1972, a piece of property became available right down the road from here, 1.5 miles, which had a hop kill on it. It was the most modern hop kill in the county. It was made from cinder block. We bought the property in January, and I remember we didn't get our use permit for a winery until July 12th, but sometime in that period, I met Joe through Howard. He had been at that time growing Pinot Noir, I think, for about 5-6 years, if I'm not mistaken. And he was selling his really beautiful Pinot Noir grapes, Martini and Pratti, it's mixed red, and or mixed black, as they sometimes call it. Anyway, we suggested to Joe that we would pay more than $150 a ton, which was what he was selling it for at that point. In the 2 months between July 12th and September 10th, I think, when our first grapes came in, we managed to get the thing remodeled, and they were still putting tar on the roof at the time. And I remember I still had the winery down in Albany, which I had to close down, and I was busy doing that during a lot of the harvest in 1973, so I had hired Robert Stemler. And Stemler, when he tasted the wine, first he thought, oh, what beautiful grapes when they came in. And he'd been making wine over in the Napa Valley, Charles Krug. He said he had never seen more beautiful grapes, and Pinot Noir, that is. And then when he tasted the wine, he was just ecstatic about it, as we all were, and we thought, we didn't know, that Pinot Noir was going to be very special in this area, but it turned out to be.
One time I was dumping over at Martini and Pratti, and some guy come up and he says, well, what are you doing with those? What kind of tonnage you getting? I said, I'm getting 3 tons the acre. He says, you're crazy. I wouldn't grow those damn things. I says, well, you got to get tonnage, you're going to make it $80 a ton. I says, well, I'll tell you what, those grapes are beautiful. I said, maybe I don't have a whole lot, but what's there is beautiful. And the guy had 10 tons the acre, whatever he said, but I'm making the money.
Yeah.
I said, yeah, you are. But someday, in my mind, when I got out of college, I started reading about grapes and wines, and I read some books about how the French were growing grapes, and how they control their crop, and all this, and thinning, and I said to myself, if we're going to survive in this area, at that time, we were getting the same price as everybody in the state. There was no differentiation between us and Lodi or Sacramento or any place. I was the first one to pull these. I was, and I was the first one to thin.
Yeah.
I never let my Pinots get over 2 tons or 3 tons.
That's something you don't often find with a grower is the willingness to thin the crop. And we realized very early on, we didn't bottle the wine until I think it was March or April of 75, because we had it in barrels for about 14, 15 months, I think, before we bottled it. And then we bottled it and started selling it maybe 6 months later. It was very well received. We got some nice press on it from the East Coast, even though we weren't selling wine much back there. Then I remember in 75, Pinot was entered in a competition in Washington, D.C., which Washingtonian magazine printed the results of, and it was a competition between California Pinot Noir and French Pinot Noir. And we came in first, and everybody identified it as a French Pinot Noir. That was what was really sort of satisfying to me.
In terms of winemakers, the first winemaker that you had in Sonoma County was
Robert Thimler.
How did you come to hire Gary Farrell?
He and his buddy Scott Harris, who later became an enologist also. He graduated from Davis. They were painting houses, and they decided they wanted to go live in Mexico for a while. And so I remember we bought their freezer, and they were selling their appliances and getting money put aside to go to Mexico. And they went down there and lasted about 6 months, I think, or maybe less. Came back, and both of them came to work for me. Gary Farrell had come to work as a cellar rat, basically, in '74. And by about 1980 or 81, he wanted to know if he could be the winemaker, and I said, sure. So he was with us from '74 until 2000. And he was our winemaker from about '81, I guess.
Was Robert Stemler there at the time as well?
No. He was in '73 only. He came around some. We actually bottled some wine for him in '74, '75, before he started his winery, just when he was getting his label going. So I think everybody began to take notice of Russian River Pinot Noir as early as the mid-'70s to the late '70s. What intrigued me from the very beginning was the fact that in California, with the appellation California, or even Sonoma County or Napa County, you didn't know really where those grapes were coming from, other than within the county someplace. And what I really was intrigued by, especially in Burgundy, and yet all of France, was the appellations, which were very specific. And that's what I tried to do in 1973 when we bottled that Pinot Noir, was it designated as coming from the Russian River off the vineyard of Joe Rocchioli. And I think we were probably the first ones to do anything like that.
Forgiano claims that he's the first one to use Russian River Valley. And I've seen one of his bottles of wine.
This goes back to the early '70s when I had first come here to start working at the winery after school. And a lot of people would ask me, where in Sonoma are you? Because we always use Sonoma County on the label. And I would say, oh, we're not in Sonoma, we're in Healdsburg, which is north of Santa Rosa. And they go, oh, okay. And then 20 minutes later, I'd meet somebody else and say, well, where in Sonoma are you? Well, I got tired of it, and I wanted to get something that was closer defined to our area. And we were south of Healdsburg, along the Russian River. And I just came up with the name Russian River Valley, because actually this area was not named like Alexander Valley or Dry Creek Valley. So I gave it the name Russian River Valley and started putting that on the label. And about the only complaint I got was from my Irish uncle in San Francisco, who thought that putting the word river on the label would kind of took we were watering down the wine.
Russian River Valley didn't exist, appellations didn't exist.
How did it start?
It actually started, I think, in 1979, and then it was the BATF, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, decided that they would do what's been done in France for centuries and actually get serious about doing geographical definitions, if you will, of grape growing areas. So we all were notified of what the criteria was to be, and were, as a county, tasked with the job of doing it. Napa County decided that they would use Napa Valley for pretty much the entire county. And we decided we didn't want to do that we wanted to have, we're a larger county, we're a more diverse county. We wanted to have more specific appellations. Sonoma Valley was obviously an area. Alexander Valley was obviously an area. Dry Creek was an area. And we down here felt that Russian River was an area.
Well, the people that were doing the actual work.
It was Bob Ellis from Mark West Vineyards, myself, Christine Deloach, and Lou Fabiano Jr. And, you know, Lou and I and Bob had been around for a long time. Lou, obviously, the longest, since he was born here. But I'd been coming up here for years as a kid. And, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind when you think of this area is fog.
And it's interesting, I don't know about now, but a couple of years ago, we were still one of the only viticulture areas that based our area on fog, on how much fog we got during the day, or during the evening and the day, I should say. So that was it. I wrote the boundaries. We did all these. I had a map. I taped all the geodetic surveys and maps together, and I think it was like 8 feet long and 6 feet wide that had to be sent in. So it was a lot of fun doing the project. We sent it in and the government then approved it.
Were people in general anxious to be part of the Russian River Valley appellation?
Well, at that time, Dry Creek Valley and Alexander Valley and Sonoma Valley were more generally known because there hadn't been any new plantings here. Like we talked about earlier, there were plantings in the 1800s and the early 1900s, and then there really wasn't anything done again until a few of us started in the 70s. So the Russian River Valley was probably the least known and the least desirable, if you will, of the appellations. So if you were on the border, there were a lot of people that opted out that, you know, really wanted to be with Dry Creek Valley or Alexander Valley. But now with the metals, with the quality of wine produced in Chardonnays and Pinot Noir, Russian River Valley has taken on a whole different meaning. And I think there are some people who wish they'd opted in instead of out. But.
So your roots to San Francisco go back a long way.
Yeah, on my mother's side, 3 generations.
How did you manage to come up to Sonoma County? I mean, what?
Well, we always had a house or a cabin up on the Russian River, and we spent most of our summers as kids up on the Russian River, myself and my 2 cousins. And when I was 15, my dad died. My mother thought it would be best for us to go up there, and that this, you know, it'd be a nicer place for me to finish school and not be influenced as much by San Francisco or whatever. I don't know exactly why, but we moved up there and I finished high school at Annalee in Sebastopol.
Did your family drink wine?
No, only my uncle. I had an uncle that used to. And when he served wine, he served different wine with each course. So if you were at his house, there would be at least 4 wines on the table.
Is that your first experience drinking wine?
Drinking wine like that, yes. Where it was very clear that each course and each thing a different wine went with. Even as a kid, we were allowed a glass of wine with our food.
So as a kid, when you were speaking as a kid, how old were you about this time?
Oh, 12 on, probably, when we first started drinking wine anyway.
What kind of wine did he put on the table? Where was it from?
Well, it was usually always French, you know, and I'm sure there were some Alsatian wines. I'm sure there was, you know, I remember the Burgundies. I do remember drinking Burgundies and very clearly seeing, you know, the Burgundy labels and the shape of the bottle. And he never sat there preaching about the wine or talking that much about it. It was just served with the food and it was there for you to enjoy. And you either enjoyed it or you didn't. Well, I enjoyed it. You know, it just suited me.
You went to school at Annalee in Sebastopol. You graduated from there.
Yeah.
And what did you do then?
I became an apprentice printer, or apprentice in the International Typographical Union.
Where did you work?
At the San Francisco Newspaper Agency. Originally I worked for the Chronicle, and then they merged with the Examiner, and it became the San Francisco Newspaper Agency that I worked for.
At some point, you started getting involved with wine.
Yeah. There were some very inexpensive Zinfandels in those days in California. You know, you could go to Pagani Brothers, which is now Kenwood, and for $1.25 you could get a gallon of Zinfandel. That was at least 4 years old. It was only stored in great big redwood uprights, but it was still a gallon of Zinfandel for $1.25. And you could put that on the table with 8 or 10 dinner guests and some spaghetti and meatballs, and everybody had a good time. You know, it didn't cost you a lot. If you didn't bring your own jug, it was $1.50.
So you drank Zinfandel mostly at that time?
Mostly when I was younger, up until probably into the late 60s. Probably in the late 60s when I was a journeyman and we weren't on strike any longer and I was making good money, I was able then to start buying Burgundies and buying German Rieslings and buying different wines from different places. You know, experimenting around and seeing what I like, buying Bordeaux's, buying, you know, California Cabernets, Barbaros, and just, you know, trying all kinds of different wine. But I think, you know, once I started drinking Burgundies, it was all over. It was like, well, those are the wines I really want to drink.
Was it during the time that you were working in San Francisco as either an apprentice or as a journeyman that you met Ed Sellium, or that?
I was working in San Francisco, but I was living up on the river.
And so, how did you meet Ed?
Our families knew each other, you know, and Ed was working for the airport in San Francisco at the time. And then he got a job in Forestville at a liquor store that also had wine. And then he went to Spears Market, which was a much larger grocery store. And by that time, Ed and I had been drinking wine a lot together, and he had been ordering wine for Fred's Liquors and kind of upgrading the selection, okay? So when he got into Spears, he had a lot more room to upgrade the selection, and he did. And through, you know, our common association with wine, drinking it and tasting it and enjoying it together, we eventually became partners in the winery.
You had a different name for your business then?
Yeah, well, we kept that name even for the first 2 years. 81 and 82, we used Hacienda Del Rio on the label. And then Hacienda Wine Cellars complained, and rather than go through an expensive lawsuit, which we wouldn't have been able to afford, we just changed our name. In '79, we started buying fruit from Lino Martinelli, from the Martinelli Vineyard, and in '80, we bought fruit from Lino Martinelli and from Joe Rocchioli.
In the beginning, you were making wine and you give some to your friends.
Oh, yeah.
And then pretty soon your friends wanted to buy it because they wanted more. They didn't want to depend on your generosity. Is that right?
Yeah.
So
in '79, we made more wine than we needed, and we gave some away, and then we sold a little, and in 1980, we made much more wine than we needed. And so, of course, we had more barrels of wine than we could possibly drink, and we started selling some of that when it got into bottle. And And I think they saw some of the 79 and maybe even the 80 in one of the wineries. I think David Lose was a BATF agent. And he contacted Ed and told him that it would be wise if we bonded before they came hunting for us. And so that's why we did. That's when we went and got the bond and figured, well, I guess we'll just get legal about it. When we bonded, which was in 81, we had to find bonded space to make the wine in. Well, we didn't have money to go out and build a building or do any of these things, so we went and approached Michael Topoulos from Russian River Vineyards about if we could make wine at his facility. We asked if we could put a couple of fermenters up there and ferment wine under his bond. He said, sure, that'd be great. He'd put us under his bond, and he'd charge us $25 a ton. And then around in, let's see, late 82, one of the local guys from Forestville, they used to go into the store, approached Ed and told him that they had a small building on their property that if we were to rebuild the building, we could probably get it bonded and start our winery on his property. That's how we started our little building in Fulton, where we were in 1983. That's where we started making wine under our own bond.
When you were buying used equipment, you didn't have any money, what?
No, we bought used barrels and had them scraped by barrel builders. Up until 1983, again, we had a customer who was a coffee taster. He and another fellow were there one day, and they were tasting, and this other man was fairly well-to-do. He had started air conditioning companies in Los Angeles. So they were asking me, well, you know, what could make the wines any better than they are? And I said, well, so right now we're buying used oak and scraping it and making it work for us. I said, but it'd be really nice to have some new oak. Well, the guy that owned the air conditioning company said, well, how much money would that cost? And I told him the price of barrels, and we'd need about 8 or 10 of them, and he wrote us a check. Just wrote a check. Here you go. I mean, we made good wines right away. Our 82 won medals, and then 84 won a lot of medals. 83 was not a really great year, and we actually got a vineyard switched on us. So it was kind of a bad turn of events.
Tell me about that, getting a vineyard switched.
We were both working our jobs. My partner had taken our boxes at the time, we were picked into lug boxes, on a trailer over to the vineyard. And we had been checking the vineyard, and he took them over there the night before they were supposed to pick the vineyard. Well, it was nighttime when he got there, and he parked the trailer and drove home. Well, the next day, we went, picked up the trailer, took it back to the winery, and I started processing the grapes. And as I'm processing the grapes, I'm calling my partner over. I said, I don't know what the hell's going on here, but this doesn't look like the fruit we were testing. And he says, really? I said, no, I don't know it's all green. This looks bad. And so we tossed out a lot of fruit, but in the fermenter, we only got, I think, 20.5 Brix. The pHs were high. The acids were low. We're getting completely different numbers. I had run acids. I had done everything. This was completely different. I said, there's no way. So finally he admitted he had picked this fruit off of young vines in front of his house and brought it back over to the vineyard for us to pick up. So we paid him 50% of what we were supposed to pay for the fruit. My partner didn't want to pay me anything. I said, no, just to keep it so we don't get a bad name in the industry or something, just we'll pay him 50%. We did. And I made wine from it. I had to really make that wine. I had to use the lees from the 82 Pinot Noir, and I had to add sugar. I had to add acid. I had to capitalize, I had to ameliorate. You're not supposed to capitalize in California, but we were starting a winery, we had to make wine. If we didn't have a wine that year, we wouldn't have been able to buy fruit for the next year. So I made it, and we entered it in 3 different tastings, and it won a bronze in the first one, a silver in the second one, and a gold in the third one. We couldn't believe it. This is insane. We priced the wine at half of the price that we sold the year before. And in '85, we made our first vineyard designate, which was Rocchioli. And that wine went on to win the sweepstakes at the California State Fair. And in those days, there was just one wine that won the sweepstakes. It wasn't a red and a white. It was just one wine. So out of over 2,100 entries and 416 wineries, our little winery did it. And, that sort of made everything go for us. From that point on, the Pinot Noir was sold out. And then I think it was about that same year that we won that, so that would have been for the '85, that would have been in '87. That same year I got a visit from Rebecca Wasserman, Russell Hone, and Michael Lafarge from Domaine Lafarge in Burgundy. And they tasted the wines. They tasted the '85s, Sonoma County and Russian River Valley, Rocchioli, and they tasted the '86s. Well, they wanted 50 cases of each wine to import to Burgundy, to France. So that again sort of reaffirmed what we were doing. They thought that the Rocchioli was Grand Cru class. And that sort of made it for me. I mean, I thought, well, I guess we've arrived. And, thanks for Rocchioli's fruit that we were able to do that. And from that point, from when the '85 got all the recognition, from that point on, our winery just went crazy. I remember Joe and Tom coming over a couple of times when we were in the Fulton facility, and I remember them coming over one time with Howie Allen, and they were, checking out the wines that I was making of theirs, the '87s, and at that point, Howie Allen approached us about building a building, and that would have been, I think, in '88. He was at the winery, and he goes, and we were packed in there. I mean, we had little aisles that go down between the barrels like this. We were filled up, and he was looking at it. And he goes, "Boy, you guys are really packed in here." And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "So how about if I build you a building?" Wait, what? Really? I mean, this is, build you a building? I went, well, we were really surprised, and he's told us, well, tell me how much room you need, how many square feet you need, and what you'd be able to pay per square foot, and I'll see what we can do. And he worked it all out. I mean, it was amazing. When we started making wine, at first it was Zinfandel and Pinot Noir, but after we got into making the Pinot Noir a couple of years, Ed and I both came to the decision we would keep making Zinfandel, which we did, from Lino Martinelli, but we only made the one Zinfandel. But with Pinot Noir, we wanted to increase our production constantly because we knew eventually with Pinot Noir we could demand a high price. With Zinfandel, not so much. And our end goal was to be able to eventually work at the winery full time. Ed and I kept our regular jobs until 1990. So from '81 to 1990, we both had second job. We had primary jobs, and our second job was the winery. So in 1990, we were finally making enough money as a winery where we could draw a salary. And that enabled us to put our other jobs and devote, all of our energy full time to the winery. And of course, from 1990 until we sold it, it grew quite a bit. It's exceptional to get good fruit year in and year out from vineyards. This doesn't happen in every vineyard. And you need that in the vineyard, and as a winemaker, you need to have a passion for the wines. Without those two things, it's just a job, or that doesn't really work to make something outstanding. It doesn't work. If you study wine at all, almost all of the great wine in the world comes from river valleys. Bordeaux, Burgundy, they all have rivers running through them. Well, the Russian River is a river valley, with deep, loamy, gravelly soils, wonderful fogs and cooling breezes, and it's just a perfect place to make Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And we also knew you could grow Zinfandel in the Russian River Valley in the right spots. And it was an unusual Zinfandel because it would be extremely low pH, high acidity, and a lot of sugar. We knew right at the start that the Russian River Valley was an unknown for most people, but that it could produce something. And it did.